protagonist had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. The city had been draining with endless noise, traffic, and stress at work. The idea of escaping to a quiet lake cabin, even if just for a couple of days, felt like a dream. Finally coming true, they packed their things carefully, making sure to bring everything they might need. Snacks, cooler full of drinks, a stack of books, and even a small Bluetooth speaker to play music while sitting by the water. The journey itself was relaxing, with the winding roads cutting through tall trees and open fields. Every mile away from the city made the protagonist feel lighter, more at peace. When the cabin finally appeared around a bend, nestled between tall pines and overlooking a shimmering lake, the protagonist could hardly believe their eyes. It was smaller than they had imagined from the photos online, but in a good way. Cozy and inviting, with a wooden deck facing the water, it looked like the perfect retreat. They parked the car, stepped out, and breathed in the fresh pine-scented air. The lake reflected the sky perfectly, so calm it almost looked like glass. A few ducks glided across the surface, leaving gentle ripples behind. For a moment, the protagonist just stood there, completely absorbed in the silence. The cabin itself was simple but comfortable. Small living room opened into a tiny kitchen, and the bedroom looked out toward the lake, promising that perfect morning view. They set their things down and explored the little deck, imagining themselves drinking coffee there the next morning, watching the sunrise. Everything seemed peaceful, perfect even. Protagonist was ready to relax, to read, maybe fish a little, and simply forget the city for a while. But the neighborhood had a different plan. As the protagonist settled in, they noticed a woman walking slowly along the road in front of the cabin. She was middle-aged, wearing oversized sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and had a clipboard in hand. There was something about her demeanor that immediately gave the protagonist pause. She waved briefly, and then her eyes narrowed as she approached. This was Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood rules, had a reputation that preceded her. Some neighbors called her strict but fair, while others whispered about her overzealous tendencies. Either way, she was not someone you could ignore. Karen's first question was sharp, almost accusatory. "Are you staying here permanently, or are you just visiting?" The protagonist, slightly taken aback by the directness, replied politely, explaining that they had rented the cabin for the weekend. Karen's expression didn't change. She seemed unconvinced, her lips pressed into a thin line.
She started
listing off some rules about short-term stays, visitors, and HOA regulations, most of which sounded confusing to someone who just wanted to enjoy a peaceful weekend. The protagonist nodded politely, trying not to make any sudden movements. Careful not to escalate the situation, Karen continued, pacing a little, clearly trying to assert authority. She mentioned the HOA's right to monitor who stayed in the neighborhood, asking for proof of the rental agreement. The protagonist fumbled a bit, but had the digital copy ready on their phone, showing it to Karen. For a brief moment, it seemed like that would settle things, but Karen didn't back down. She kept insisting that even with a rental agreement, they were breaking some obscure neighborhood rule at this point. A few neighbors appeared in the distance, curious about the confrontation. Karen's voice became louder, and the protagonist felt a growing mix of anxiety and frustration. They had come here to escape stress, not to argue over rules they didn't even know existed. Yet they tried to remain calm, explaining that they had rented the cabin legally, that the property owner had confirmed the stay, and that no laws were being broken. Karen wasn't convinced. Her tone became more insistent, almost threatening. She suggested that if the protagonist didn't leave, she might have to take further action. The protagonist felt a chill, realizing that this peaceful weekend might be turning into a real conflict. Still, they held their ground, determined not to be bullied. After all, they had every right to be there. The protagonist returned inside the cabin, closing the door slowly, but keeping the curtains open just enough to see Karen pacing outside. They tried to shake off the unease by making a cup of coffee, telling themselves to enjoy the lake, the quiet, and the beautiful scenery. Sitting on the deck, they tried to listen to the birds, the soft lapping of water against the shore, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. But every sound seemed magnified now, every movement outside drawing their attention as the afternoon went on. The protagonist explored the area around the cabin, trying to immerse themselves in nature. The lake was more beautiful up close, with clear water and smooth stones underfoot. They skipped a few stones, watched the sunlight dance across the ripples, and felt their tension slowly easing. Yet the memory of Karen's stern look and her warnings lingered in the back of their mind. By evening, the protagonist was determined not to let anyone ruin their retreat. They lit a small fire in the outdoor fireplace, settled into a chair with a blanket, and watched the sunset over the lake. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, reflecting perfectly in the water. It should have been a perfect moment of peace. And in a way, it was as if they could ignore the simmering worry about Karen and the HOA that night. As the protagonist prepared to sleep, they heard distant voices on the road outside. Karen was still around, checking the area, making sure no rules were being broken. The protagonist lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm their racing mind. They wondered how a simple weekend getaway could turn into such a tense situation. Despite the anxiety, there was also a strange sense of determination. Knew they had done nothing wrong, and that they weren't going to leave just because someone demanded it, even in the darkness. With the soft sounds of the lake outside, the protagonist felt a mix of fear, frustration, and excitement. They had no idea what would happen next, but they were ready to face it. This weekend, which was supposed to be simple and relaxing, had unexpectedly turned into a test of patience, courage, and staying calm under pressure. And as they finally drifted off to sleep, they promised themselves one thing: they wouldn't let anyone, not even Karen, ruin their escape to the lake. Re-observations of nature around the cabin. The next morning, the protagonist woke up feeling optimistic. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the water of the lake sparkled as if inviting them to start the day. After a quick breakfast, they decided to take a walk along the lake shore. Hoping that the fresh air and calm water would wash away the lingering stress from the previous day, everything felt peaceful, almost like the world had paused for them. But it didn't take long for the calm to be interrupted as they rounded a bend near the cabin. They saw Karen again, standing near the road with her clipboard, staring directly at them. The protagonist tried to avoid eye contact and continued walking, hoping she would leave them alone. But Karen's sharp voice carried across the quiet neighborhood. "Where do you think you're going? Aren't you supposed to check out already?" Protagonist froze. They hadn't left the cabin and they had no intention of doing so. "Shh, I'm just taking a walk," they replied calmly, trying not to sound defensive. "I'm staying here legally. I rented the cabin for the weekend." Karen's lips tightened. "The HOA has rules about who can stay here and how long you need to leave. You don't belong here," she said, her tone almost accusing, almost triumphant, as if she had caught them doing something wrong. The protagonist felt a wave of frustration rising. They had come here for peace and relaxation, not to be harassed every few steps. "I have a rental agreement," they said firmly. "I'm allowed to be here. I haven't broken any laws or rules. You're not the police." Karen's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, making the protagonist instinctively take a small step back. "I don't care. You're disturbing the neighborhood. People here don't like strangers who just show up. I'm telling you no, you need to leave, or I'll have to involve the authorities." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. Involving. The authorities sounded serious, but they stayed composed. "You're welcome to call the police," they said, "but I've done nothing wrong. I'm a paying guest of the cabin's owner. You don't have the right to force me out." Karen huffed, muttering something under her breath about people not respecting rules anymore. She scribbled something on her clipboard, clearly preparing for a confrontation. The protagonist realized that Karen wasn't going to back down easily. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore, it was turning into a full-blown battle of wills, determined not to let Karen ruin their weekend. The protagonists continued their walk along the lake, trying to focus on the gentle ripples of water and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. They skipped stones, watching them bounce once, twice, 3 times across the surface, and even laughed quietly at their own clumsy throws. For a moment, it felt like the world could still be normal. Like the lake was a safe place, untouched by conflict. But Karen didn't give up. She started pacing back and forth near the road in front of the cabin, muttering into her phone. Protagonist guessed she was probably calling the HOA or trying to document everything for later. The tension in the neighborhood was growing. A few other residents peeked out of their windows, whispering to each other, curious about the confrontation. The protagonist felt the weight of those silent eyes, judging them or wondering what this stranger had done to upset Karen by mid-afternoon. The protagonist decided to return to the cabin and relax indoors. They turned the key in the door and stepped inside, closing it carefully behind them. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to breathe again, letting the familiar comfort of the cabin sink in. They put on some soft music and made another cup of coffee, determined to reclaim a small piece of their weekend. But peace remained elusive. From the window, they could see Karen still lingering outside, clipboard in hand, speaking in a low voice to someone on her phone. The protagonist tried to ignore it, but the tension was impossible to shake. They remembered the warning from yesterday and realized that Karen might actually follow through on her threats. A mix of anxiety and anger bubbled inside them. Was someone so obsessed with controlling others' lives? Trying to regain focus, the protagonist decided to call the cabin owner, hoping to get some reassurance. The conversation was brief, but comforting. The owner confirmed that the rental was completely legitimate, that the HOA had no legal power to force them out, and that they had every right to stay. Feeling bolstered by this confirmation, the protagonist felt a surge of confidence. Wanted to escalate, they would be ready. Late in the afternoon, the protagonist decided to take the kayak out onto the lake. The gentle rocking of the boat, the soft splash of paddles, and the sun reflecting on the water helped them relax in a way that nothing else had. They floated for a while, letting the calm lake absorb their stress. The birds glided above, diving into the water for fish, and the occasional dragonfly danced near the kayak. Nature was reminding them why they had come here in the first place. But the serenity was short-lived. As the protagonist returned to the shore, they noticed a car parked suspiciously near the cabin. Karen was still nearby, speaking animatedly on the phone. Her glare followed them as they stepped onto the deck, clipboard waving slightly in her hand. The protagonist's patience was wearing thin. They knew this confrontation was not going to end easily, and Karen's persistence was. Pushing their nerves to the limit, determined to stand their ground, the protagonist stepped outside to face Karen directly. "You've made your point," they said calmly, "but I'm not leaving. I'm here legally, and I'm just trying to enjoy my weekend. Please stop harassing me." Karen didn't back down. "You think you can just ignore the rules?" Snapped, "I'm responsible for keeping this neighborhood safe and orderly. You're breaking the rules, and I won't allow it." The protagonist felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. They had followed the law, respected the property, and done nothing wrong, yet Karen was acting like they had committed a crime. Still, they tried to remain polite, hoping to de-escalate. "I understand you want to protect the neighborhood," they said, "but I'm not a threat. I'm a guest, and I have permission to be here." Karen's expression hardened. She turned to make another call on her phone, muttering about authorities and taking care of this situation. The protagonist watched, tense, realizing that Karen might indeed involve law enforcement. The thought made their stomach twist with anxiety. But they refused to panic. As the afternoon turned into evening, the protagonist tried to focus on other things. They cooked a simple dinner, trying to distract themselves from the looming confrontation. The smell of grilled fish and herbs filled the cabin, and the warmth of the oven felt comforting. Yet every few minutes, their eyes flicked to the window. Keeping watch on Karen's movements outside, the tension continued into the night. The protagonist sat on the deck under a blanket, staring at the stars, trying to find peace in the vast sky above. They reminded themselves that they had done nothing wrong. They had every right to enjoy this weekend, and that Karen's behavior, though frustrating, could not control them. Despite their efforts, a knot of unease lingered. Every shadow, every movement outside, reminded them of Karen's persistence. They knew that tomorrow could bring an even bigger confrontation, but they were mentally preparing to face it head-on. This weekend was no longer just about relaxation. It had become a test of patience, courage, and standing up for oneself in the face of unreasonable behavior. By the time the protagonist finally went to bed, exhaustion from both tension and vigilance weighed heavily on them. They lay awake for a while, listening to the distant calls of night birds and the soft splash of the lake against the shore. Even in sleep, thoughts of the upcoming confrontation with Karen lingered. They knew the situation was escalating, and that the next day could bring unexpected challenges. Yet there was also a small, defiant sense of satisfaction. The protagonist had stood their ground, remained polite but firm, and refused to be intimidated. They had claimed a small victory by maintaining their space and asserting their rights. And while the weekend was not turning out as peacefully as they had hoped, they felt a growing determination to not let anyone, especially Karen, take away their moment of escape. This part captures the rising tension,
multiple confrontations,
inner thoughts, and the protagonist's growing determination, making it both interesting and relatable, and can reach close to 2,000 words when expanded with extra dialogue, nature observations, and neighborhood interactions. The next morning began with a sense of unease. The protagonist woke up early, as usual, hoping the morning air and the calm of the lake would help settle their nerves. The sun was barely rising, casting soft orange and pink colors across the water. The lake looked peaceful, almost untouched, as if yesterday's tension had not happened. But the moment they stepped onto the deck, their stomachs sank. Karen was already outside. She had arrived early, standing near the edge of the road, clipboard in hand. She was pacing slowly, muttering to herself, occasionally looking toward the protagonist's cabin. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her body language left no doubt. She was prepared for confrontation. The protagonist tried to ignore her, taking a deep breath, reminding themselves to stay calm. They decided to start the day with a walk along the lake, hoping to reclaim some peace before things escalated. The water was glassy, reflecting. The rising sun and birds chirped softly from the trees. For a moment, they could almost forget about Karen, but that peace didn't last long. As they rounded a bend near the cabin, they saw Karen again, now speaking animatedly on her phone. Her voice carried across the quiet morning. The protagonist tried to ignore her and continued walking, but Karen's shouting interrupted the morning. Calm. I've asked this person to leave multiple times. This is harassment. I'm calling for backup. Her words sent a chill through the protagonist's chest. They slowed down, realizing that Karen was not just upset, she was escalating the situation. By late morning, it became clear that Karen had indeed called 911. The protagonist noticed flashing lights in the distance, and soon 2 police cars pulled up near the cabin. Their hearts pounded as they watched officers step out, approaching with cautious but professional expressions. The protagonist knew they had done nothing wrong, but they also understood how serious the situation could look from the outside. As the officers approached, Karen stepped forward. Gesturing wildly and explaining her side of the story, she spoke quickly, pointing toward the cabin, talking about intruders and people who refused to leave. The protagonist felt a mix of disbelief and frustration. Karen had twisted the situation completely, making it sound as though they were breaking the law when, in reality, they had rented the cabin legally. The protagonist took a deep breath and stepped forward to speak to the officers. They calmly explained the situation, showing the rental agreement on their phone. I have rented this cabin for the weekend, they said firmly. The owner has approved my stay. I've done nothing illegal. I'm not trespassing. The officers listened attentively, asking questions about the rental, the duration of the stay, and the owner's contact information. The protagonist answered politely but confidently, providing every detail clearly. They could feel Karen fuming, in the background, muttering under her breath, clearly frustrated that the officers were listening to the other side of the story. After a few minutes of questioning, one of the officers nodded. Everything seems in order, he said. You have a legal rental agreement, and there's no law being broken here. We understand that there's a disagreement with the HOA, but legally you are allowed to stay. The protagonist felt a wave of relief wash over them. After days of tension and worry, it finally seemed like the situation was beginning to resolve. Karen, however, did not take the news well. She waved her arms, insisting that the officers do something, that this was against neighborhood rules, and that people like this shouldn't be allowed here. The officers listened politely, but it was clear that without legal backing, they could not force the protagonist to leave. Karen's face turned red with frustration. The protagonist could barely hide a small smirk at her reaction. despite the official reassurance. The tension did not disappear entirely. Karen stayed nearby, pacing, muttering, and occasionally taking notes. The protagonist tried to focus on their surroundings, stepping onto the deck and looking out over the lake. The water reflected the bright morning sun, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and for a moment, the beauty of nature seemed to calm their racing thoughts. They decided to make themselves a strong cup of coffee and sit on the deck, trying to reclaim some peace. The smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of the mug in their hands helped calm them, and they took slow, deep breaths. They realized that this confrontation with Karen had tested their patience, but they were proud of themselves for remaining calm and polite despite the harassment as the day progressed. The protagonists attempted to continue with their plans for the weekend. They brought out the kayak, pushing it gently into the lake, and paddled around in the bright sunlight. Now the lake was calm, the water clear, and the feeling of floating, unbothered by traffic or noise, was almost meditative. For the first time in days, the protagonist felt the tension begin to fade, replaced by a sense of relief and satisfaction. But Karen wasn't finished. She continued to lurk near the cabin, sometimes calling the HOA, sometimes muttering under her breath. It became clear that she saw the arrival of law enforcement as a temporary setback, not a defeat. The protagonist realized that while the legal side of the conflict had been resolved, the psychological battle was far from over. Karen's constant presence was draining, forcing them to remain alert even while trying to enjoy the lake, determined not to let Karen ruin their weekend. The protagonists focused on what they could control. They explored the area around the cabin, taking long walks along the shore, watching birds and observing small fish in the clear water. They practiced mindfulness, paying attention to the gentle rustle of the leaves, the soft splash of the water against rocks, and the distant sound of a woodpecker tapping on a tree. Nature became a refuge, a place where Karen's hostility could not reach them. By evening, the protagonist had made a small fire outside on the deck. He sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and staring at the reflection of the sunset on the lake. The sky was ablaze with colors deep reds, purples, and golds, and the protagonist felt a sense of accomplishment. They had stood their ground, dealt with an unreasonable neighbor, and even faced the involvement of the police without losing composure. Karen, still lingering near the road, finally seemed to recognize that she couldn't change the situation. Immediately, her glare remained, but she no longer waved her arms or shouted at anyone. The protagonists allowed themselves a small sigh of relief. The worst confrontation of the weekend was over. Now it was about enjoying what remained. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the soft sounds of the lake, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. They realized that this weekend had turned into a test of resilience, patience, and self-control. Karen's harassment, the threat of law enforcement, and the constant stress could have ruined their retreat. But instead, it had strengthened their confidence. They had learned that standing up for oneself politely and firmly could make a huge difference, even in the face of unreasonable behavior. Despite the exhaustion, there was also a sense of triumph. The protagonist had not been intimidated, had followed the rules, and had relied on calm logic rather than anger or fear. They understood that Karen might continue to be a nuisance for the rest of the weekend, but at least the legal threat was resolved, and they had successfully defended their right to enjoy their stay. As they finally drifted to sleep, the protagonist felt a mixture of relief, pride, and determination. The confrontation with Karen had tested them in ways they had not anticipated, but they had emerged stronger and more confident. The lake, the cabin, and the surrounding nature had become not just a place of retreat, but a symbol of resilience. And as they closed their eyes, the protagonists knew that no matter what happened next, they were ready to face it head-on. This part emphasizes the escalation of conflict with Karen calling 911, the protagonist interacting with police calmly. Tension mixed with nature scenes and inner thoughts, a sense of personal growth and resilience. The morning after the confrontation with the police arrived, but the calm of the lake did not last. The protagonist woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel and voices raised in agitation. He quickly realized it was Karen again, this time with a small group of neighbors who seemed to have rallied behind her cause. The protagonist stepped onto the deck, coffee in hand, and watched as Karen waved her arms, speaking in that same sharp, commanding tone that had become all too familiar. Karen's energy was almost overwhelming. She had clearly decided that calling the police once was not enough, and that if she wanted to push the protagonist out, she would need to gather backup. The neighbors she had gathered seemed nervous, unsure of what was happening but eager to support Karen's claims. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at the protagonist's cabin as though expecting some illegal activity. The protagonist felt a mix of irritation and determination. They knew they had done nothing wrong, and yet Karen's persistence was exhausting. They reminded themselves to stay calm and decided to confront the situation logically rather than emotionally. With coffee in hand, they stepped outside. Keeping a polite smile but maintaining a firm posture, Karen spotted them immediately and charged forward. "I told you, this is illegal. You have no right to stay here," she shouted, her voice echoing. Across the lake, the neighbors murmured in agreement, some nodding while others seemed unsure. The protagonist took a deep breath, then calmly replied, "I have rented this cabin legally. The owner has approved my stay. Everything I am doing is within the law." Karen, unfazed, turned to the neighbors. "See, you don't understand. We have rules here. People like this shouldn't be allowed to ruin our community." Her face was red with anger, and her hands shook slightly as she gestured wildly. The protagonist realized that Karen was no longer trying to convince them. They were now performing for the audience, hoping the neighbors would pressure them. The protagonist decided to stay calm and let facts speak for themselves. They invited the neighbors over to see the rental agreement and explained that the cabin had been booked through a legitimate platform with the owner's permission. Some neighbors looked skeptical while others seemed surprised. It became clear that Karen's story was beginning to unravel. Still, Karen refused to back down. She began taking pictures of the cabin, the deck, and even the protagonist's car. Muttering about evidence and violations, it was clear she planned to escalate further. The protagonist realized that the best defense now was patience. They avoided eye contact with Karen, focusing instead on the serene lake and the early morning sun glinting off the water. By mid-morning, the tension escalated. Karen had contacted the HOA again, and this time it seemed she had convinced someone. An authority to send a formal warning letter, the protagonist received a printed notice slipped under the door. It was full of formal language about violations of community regulations and unauthorized use of property, but nothing mentioned the law. The protagonist read it carefully, noting that it contained threats, but no legal grounds to remove them. Despite the frustration, the protagonist refused to let it ruin the weekend. They decided to take control of the situation by documenting everything carefully. They took photos of the cabin, their rental agreement, the surrounding property, and even Karen's behavior from a safe distance. This documentation would serve as evidence if Karen escalated things further. Karen, however, seemed to sense that her tactics were failing. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She tried to block the protagonist's access to certain areas of the property, waving her arms and yelling about private spaces and restricted zones. The protagonist remained calm, avoiding confrontation, and simply moved around her. Using polite words but firm boundaries, by afternoon, the protagonist realized that Karen was trying a new tactic: intimidation. She had parked herself near the dock, glaring, taking notes, and occasionally shouting at anyone who passed by. The protagonist noticed that some of the neighbors were becoming uncomfortable with her intensity. A few even quietly told Karen that she should let the guest enjoy their weekend. This subtle support bolstered the protagonist's confidence. Though Karen remained undeterred, the protagonist decided to take a break by kayaking on the lake. The water was cool and calm, and the rhythmic movement of paddling helped clear their mind. They thought about how absurd the situation had become. A peaceful weekend getaway had turned into a standoff with a hostile neighbor. But as they glided across the lake, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would not allow Karen's harassment to dominate their experience. Returning to the cabin, the protagonist found that Karen had started leaving notes under the door, each one more aggressive than the last. It contained accusations and demands, but the protagonist carefully read and filed each one. They knew that any future legal or HOA actions could be countered with a clear record of Karen's behavior. The tension escalated even further when Karen attempted to involve local media. She called a small community newspaper, claiming that dangerous trespassers were staying at the lake cabins. The journalist arrived in the late afternoon, camera in hand, asking the protagonist for a statement, remaining calm. The protagonist explained the situation clearly and concisely. They had rented the cabin legally, had permission from the owner, and were being harassed by a neighbor. The journalist listened and took notes, asking polite follow-up questions. Karen, frustrated that the media were not immediately siding with her, became more aggressive, pacing back and forth, muttering about unfair coverage and lying neighbors. It was a surreal scene. The protagonist realized that Karen's obsession had reached a point where her own behavior was becoming a public spectacle. The journalist left, noting that the story needed verification, which meant Karen's attempts to escalate were temporarily stalled. By evening, the protagonist returned to the deck, exhausted but determined. They built a small fire, brewed tea, and reflected on the events of the day. Karen's escalation had been intense, but the protagonist had maintained composure throughout. They realized that patience, calm communication, and careful documentation had become their strongest tools. As night fell, the protagonist could hear Karen muttering to herself near the road, perhaps plotting her next move. But instead of fear or anger, the protagonist felt a quiet sense of triumph. They had faced repeated harassment, threats, and intimidation without giving in. The lake, the cabin, and the natural surroundings remained theirs to enjoy. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the gentle sounds of the water lapping against the shore, the protagonist reflected on how much they had learned about human behavior and resilience. Karen's obsession and hostility had tested their patience, but they had discovered an inner strength they hadn't fully recognized before. Every time Karen escalated, the protagonist responded with calm logic, documentation, and quiet confidence, proving that reason and patience often outshine aggression. Despite the exhausting day, there was also a sense of anticipation. The protagonist knew that Karen might continue to escalate, but they also understood that their preparation and calm demeanor would make it difficult for her to succeed. They resolved to face whatever came next with the same steady approach. Polite but firm, calm but unwavering. Always ready to stand their ground by the time sleep finally came. The protagonist felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. They had survived one of the most intense days of their life, dealing with harassment, intimidation, and the persistent presence of a hostile neighbor. Yet they had emerged not just intact, but stronger, more confident, and more aware of their own resilience. The night was quiet, the lake serene, and for the first time, the protagonist allowed themselves to feel that victory could come not just from confrontation, but from patience, careful planning, and the calm assertion of one's rights. Karen's escalation had tested them to the limit, but the protagonist had met that challenge, and they knew that whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it with the same courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination. Neflectation. The next morning, the protagonist awoke to an unusual calm. After days of constant tension and harassment, the lake seemed almost peaceful, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final showdown. But deep down, they knew this. Calm was temporary. Karen's obsession had not faded. She was relentless. The protagonist had prepared for this moment, gathering all documentation of Karen's behavior, the rental agreement, photos of the property, and notes about each interaction. They knew that today might be decisive. As the protagonist stepped onto the deck, they immediately noticed movement by the road. Karen had arrived earlier than usual, pacing back and forth with a clipboard in hand. Her energy was high, almost manic, and she was muttering to herself in a mix of anger and frustration. Some neighbors were nearby, seemingly drawn by the drama. The protagonist realized that Karen was not just targeting them personally anymore. She was trying to make a public spectacle, hoping to gather support for her side. instead of confronting her immediately. The protagonist decided to take a strategic approach. They walked down to the dock, pretending to enjoy the morning sun while keeping a careful eye on Karen. From this distance, they could observe her behavior without escalating the situation. Karen's gestures were dramatic. She waved her arms, shouted at passing cars, and occasionally scribbled furiously on her clipboard. It was clear she wanted attention, and every bit of her behavior seemed designed to provoke a reaction. After a while, Karen approached the cabin itself, knocking loudly and calling out the protagonist's name. They stepped outside calmly, keeping a neutral expression. "Good morning," the protagonist said softly. "How can I help you today?" Karen's face twisted with anger. "Help me. You have no right to be here. I've called the HOA, the police, and even the media. This is unacceptable. You need to leave immediately." She thrust her clipboard forward, but the protagonist simply took a step back. Keeping the interaction polite but firm, "I've shown my rental agreement," the protagonist replied evenly. "I have permission from the owner to stay here. No of my actions are legal. I am not violating any rules, and I am not leaving because there is no legal reason for me to do so." Karen's frustration was visible. She had been building momentum for days, escalating every interaction, and now her opponent remained calm and collected. For a moment, she seemed unsure, scanning the cabin and the surroundings, perhaps realizing that the protagonist's logic was solid. But her pride and obsession would not let her back down. This time, the protagonist decided to raise the stakes in a calm but powerful way. They calmly walked inside and returned with a folder containing all documentation: rental agreements, photos, copies of previous complaints, and even a timeline of Karen's harassment. Holding the folder firmly, they said, "If you want to continue this, I suggest we do it through the proper channels. Here's everything you need. You can take this to the HOA or the authorities, but I will not engage in harassment or intimidation. Any more, the choice is yours." Karen's eyes widened as she took the folder. She flipped through the pages rapidly, muttering under her breath. For a moment, the protagonist felt a sense of vindication. After days of Karen trying to provoke them, they were now holding the facts, the proof, and the upper hand. Every attempt Karen had made to escalate had been countered with calm, preparation, and reason. However, Karen's reaction was unpredictable. Instead of calming down, she decided to escalate one final time. She stormed over to the neighbors she had gathered, waving her arms and shouting about illegal occupants and community rules. Some neighbors seemed tired of her constant agitation. A few even whispered among themselves, questioning whether she was overreacting. The protagonist observed silently, realizing that Karen's credibility was starting to crumble. By mid-morning, the HOA had been officially contacted. With the folder of evidence, the protagonist knew that now it was out of their hands. Karen had pushed the situation to formal channels, but all the evidence clearly showed that the protagonist was legally staying at the cabin, and that Karen had repeatedly harassed them without cause. The power had shifted subtly but unmistakably to the protagonist. Meanwhile, Karen attempted one last personal maneuver. She marched up to the cabin again, trying to confront the protagonist directly, accusing them of being disrespectful and defiant. The protagonist listened patiently, refusing to raise their voice or react emotionally. They explained once more, calmly and clearly, that they had every right to be there and that continued harassment could be considered legal harassment on her part. This simple statement, delivered with composure, seemed to unnerve Karen. As the afternoon approached, tension still hung in the air, but the lake began to reclaim its serenity. The protagonist finally sat on the deck, sipping tea, feeling a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. The psychological battle with Karen had been draining, but they had maintained control, using reason, patience, and documentation as shields. Karen, now less theatrical, seemed to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that her actions had limits, and that she could not simply intimidate or bully her way into controlling others. The next moment of drama came unexpectedly. A local officer, having reviewed the calls and complaints Karen had made, arrived at the cabin. They spoke politely but firmly with both parties. Karen attempted to assert her narrative, but the officer, having reviewed the documents, rental agreements, and the timeline of events, explained that the protagonist was staying legally and that there was no cause for removal. Karen fumed silently. Unable to argue effectively in front of a neutral authority figure, this official confirmation was a turning point. Karen's energy and aggression began to diminish. She continued to grumble, but it was clear that her attempts to assert control were failing. The protagonist observed quietly, feeling relief mixed with a sense of accomplishment. They had faced an incredibly difficult situation, and through preparation, calmness, and respect for the law, they had not only survived but also emerged as the stronger party. With the officer's departure, the protagonist finally allowed themselves to enjoy the lake fully. They kayaked, fished, and walked along the shoreline, feeling a profound sense of peace. The natural beauty of the lake seemed more vivid than ever, as if the water and trees were celebrating their resilience. The tension that had clouded the previous days seemed to lift, replaced by clarity and calm. In the evening, as the sun began to set, the protagonist sat on the dock, reflecting on the events. They realized that this ordeal had taught them valuable lessons: the importance of patience, the power of documentation, the need to remain calm in the face of provocation, and the resilience of the human spirit. Karen had been a formidable antagonist, but their own steadiness and reason had been more powerful. Even as night fell, there was no fear, only reflection. The protagonist could hear Karen's car driving away in the distance, leaving the lake behind, at least for now. The tension had finally dissipated. They allowed themselves to feel a quiet sense of victory, not through confrontation or aggression, but through calm perseverance and intelligence. Before going to sleep, the protagonist wrote in a journal, recounting each incident, each interaction, and each victory. It was not just a record of events, but a reminder of their own strength and capacity to handle difficult, stressful situations. They understood that life often presents challenges that test patience and resilience, and it is through these trials that one discovers inner strength. As they drifted to sleep, the lake was silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The protagonist knew that challenges would come again in life, but they had faced one of the most intense confrontations imaginable and had come through with dignity and confidence. The story that began with tension, harassment, and fear had concluded with calm, resolution, and personal growth. In the days that followed, the protagonist continued to enjoy their time at the cabin. Karen did not return, and the neighbors who had doubted her overzealousness began to understand the truth. The lake cabin, once a scene of confrontation, became a sanctuary once more, a place of reflection, peace, and the quiet knowledge that the protagonist had stood firm against unnecessary hostility and intimidation. This final part of the story illustrates not just the resolution of a conflict, but the triumph of reason, preparation, and patience over aggression and obsession. It shows that in the face of relentless harassment, maintaining calm, documenting events, and approaching challenges strategically can lead not only to survival, but also to personal growth and victory. The protagonist left the lake cabin finally, with a sense of closure, stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever. Karen's attempts to control and intimidate had failed, not because of luck, but because the protagonist had acted with intelligence, calm, and resilience. The lake, now serene, reflected not just the sun and sky, but the quiet strength of someone who had faced adversity and emerged victorious, ready for whatever life would bring next.